There is a clay tablet in the British Museum, baked hard by 4,000 years of time, that contains a list of remedies. The script is cuneiform, the wedge-shaped impressions that Mesopotamian scribes pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. And the language is Akkadian, a Semitic tongue that was the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for nearly 2,000 years. The tablet is not dramatic. It does not contain prophecies or royal decrees or the mythological narratives that make the headlines when new cuneiform texts are published. It contains, in its compressed and damaged columns, instructions for treating a man with headaches. You grind certain plants together, you add fat, you apply the preparation to the affected area while speaking certain words. The words are addressed to a goddess. The preparation and the prayer are not separate procedures, they are one procedure, inseparable. Because the ancient Mesopotamian healer did not make the distinction between the natural and the supernatural that we have come to regard as fundamental. The headache was a symptom with a physical dimension and a divine dimension, and treating it properly required addressing both. I have spent a long time with this tablet in my mind. Not because the remedy is interesting, it is not in the sense that it probably did not work, or did not work for the reason the healer believed, but because of what the tablet reveals about the relationship between human beings and their bodies, and between human beings and the mystery of why the body fails. The healer who inscribed this tablet, or who dictated it to a scribe, or who copied it from an earlier tablet in the tradition of medical education that Mesopotamia developed over centuries, understood something about suffering that we have not entirely superseded. He understood that when the body breaks down, the person who inhabits the body is frightened, and that the treatment of fear is not separate from the treatment of pain, and that a healer is not merely a technician applying a procedure, but a mediator between the sick person and the forces, whatever they are, that govern the body's well-being. This is the story I want to tell. Not the story of ancient medicine as a parade of errors gradually corrected by the advance of science, though errors were made, certainly, and the advance of science is real. The story of what it meant to be a sick human being in the ancient world, and what kind of people and what kind of knowledge came to stand between the sick person and their suffering, and what was lost and what was preserved in the long transmission of that knowledge, from Babylon to Alexandria to Baghdad to medieval Europe, and finally to us. The oldest medical texts we possess are Mesopotamian. The Sumerians, who inhabited the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates from roughly 3,500 BCE, left us the earliest written records of medical practice, lists of plants with their medical applications, descriptions of symptoms and their treatments, references to the healers who performed these treatments. The vocabulary of this early medical practice is already complex and differentiated. There were Sioux physicians who treated the body with physical remedies, herbs and poultices and surgical interventions. There were Ashipur, exorcists or ritual specialists who treated the supernatural dimension of illness through incantation and ritual, and there were Baru, diviners who interpreted the signs that illness presented in terms of divine communication, reading the body's malfunction as a message that needed to be decoded. These three were not competing practitioners. They often worked together because the system they operated within assumed that illness had multiple dimensions that required different kinds of expertise. The pharmacopoeia of ancient Mesopotamia was extensive. The clay tablets preserve hundreds of plant-based remedies, and the modern pharmacologist reading them can identify many of the plants involved and confirm that some of them have genuine pharmacological activity. Licorice root, which was one of the most commonly used Mesopotamian remedies, contains glycyrrhizin, a compound that has anti-inflammatory and antiviral properties. Willow bark, which Mesopotamian healers used for pain, contains salicin, the precursor of aspirin. Opium poppy, which was cultivated in Mesopotamia from at least 3,400 BCE and appears in the medical texts as a remedy for pain, contains the alkaloids that are still our most effective tools against severe pain. These people were not guessing randomly. Over centuries of accumulated observation and experiment, not systematic scientific experiment in our sense, but the careful empirical observation of what worked and what did not. Passed down through the scribal tradition of medical education, they had identified plants that actually did what they were supposed to do. The surgical tradition of Mesopotamia is less well documented, but it existed. The Code of Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian legal document dated to around 1754 BCE, contains several provisions that give us an indirect view of surgical practice. One of the most cited runs roughly: if a physician performs a major operation on a nobleman with a bronze lancet and causes the man's death, or opens a nobleman's eye socket with a bronze lancet and destroys the nobleman's eye, they shall cut off his hand. This law has been used often as evidence of the brutal environment in which Mesopotamian surgeons operated. The threat of physical punishment for failed operations presumably concentrated the mind wonderfully. But it also tells us something more fundamental, that there were physicians performing eye surgery in Babylonia in 1754 BCE, that a bronze lancet was available and in use for surgical purposes, that the distinction between success and failure in an eye operation was recognized and legally meaningful. The law exists because the practice exists. You do not regulate what no one does. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a different kind of document entirely. It dates to approximately 1600 BCE, the Egyptian New Kingdom period, though it is generally understood to be a copy of an earlier text, perhaps from around 3000 BCE, during the Old Kingdom. It was purchased in Luxor in 1862 by the American Egyptologist Edwin Smith, for whom it is named, and it sat in his estate for years before it was finally analysed and translated in the early 20th century. When the scholarly world finally grasped what it contained, the reaction was something close to astonishment. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a surgical textbook. It describes 48 cases of injury, primarily, rather than disease, in a systematic format that feels almost modern. The case number, the title of the injury, the examination procedure, the diagnosis, the treatment, and a verdict on the prognosis. The prognosis categories are the most revealing: an ailment which I will treat, an ailment with which I will contend, and an ailment not to be treated. The third category, cases the physician judges untreatable, is honest in a way that feels startling. The ancient physician, working 4,000 years ago with the tools and knowledge available to him, was willing to say, directly and without euphemism, "This person cannot be helped by anything I can do." This is not a failure of medical ethics. It is a display of medical ethics, the refusal to pretend that treatment is possible when it is not, when false hope would simply extend suffering. The descriptions of injuries in the Edwin Smith Papyrus are clinically precise. Case 1. A gaping wound in the head. The physician is instructed to examine the wound with his fingers, to assess the depth of the penetration, to determine whether the skull is intact or fractured, to check the patient's consciousness and coherence. The examination procedure is systematic and specific in the way that examination procedures need to be when they are teaching documents. The same sequence of checks each time, so that the physician in training learns to do them in the right order, to notice the right things, to form the right conclusions. The treatment prescribed for the gaping head wound involves cleaning, stitching, and applying fresh meat to the wound on the first day. Fresh meat contains enzymes and growth factors that may genuinely have assisted healing, followed by grease and honey on subsequent days. The antibacterial properties of honey are now well established. The ancient Egyptian physician did not know the mechanism, but he knew the effect because he had seen it work. Case 17 in the Edwin Smith Papyrus describes what appears to be a cervical spine injury. The patient has been injured in the neck. The text describes the neck being bent, suggesting a fall or a blow, and cannot move his arms and legs. The physician examines him and finds the injury at the spine. He identifies the symptoms: paralysis of the extremities, urinary and fecal incontinence, and reaches the correct conclusion: the spinal cord has been damaged. The prognosis is an ailment not to be treated. The physician knows there is nothing to be done. He knows that the damage to the spinal cord is irreversible. He does not know what the spinal cord is in the anatomical sense. He has a different framework entirely for understanding the body's structure. But he has observed enough cases of this specific pattern of injury and these specific consequences to know the pattern and know what it means for the patient's survival. This knowledge, the knowledge of prognosis, of what patterns of symptoms and injury lead to what outcomes, is the kind of knowledge that can only be accumulated through long experience, through the careful observation of many cases and their outcomes, through a tradition of medical education that passes these observations from generation to generation. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is a teaching document. It was written to transmit the accumulated clinical wisdom of the Egyptian medical tradition to the next generation of healers. The precision and systematism of its case descriptions are pedagogical tools. They model the kind of attention and the kind of structured thinking that a good physician needs to bring to each case. The papyrus is not describing extraordinary events. It is describing the routine application of medical knowledge in clinical situations. Let me give you a specific healer. His name, or at least the name associated with him in the tradition, was Imhotep. He lived in the 3rd dynasty of ancient Egypt, around 2650 BCE, and his historical identity is genuinely unusual. He was the court physician and architect and high priest of the pharaoh Djoser, the man credited with designing the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first large stone structure in human history, a single person who was simultaneously the most accomplished architect of his age and one of the most celebrated physicians. This combination was possible in the ancient Egyptian context in a way it could not have been later, because the boundaries between different fields of expertise were drawn differently then, and because the kind of intelligence that could master the mathematics and physics of pyramid construction could also master the art of clinical observation. Imhotep was so celebrated as a healer during his lifetime, and so venerated in the tradition that followed him, that by the late period of Egyptian history he had been deified, made into a god of medicine, served by his own priests in temples where the sick came to sleep and receive healing dreams. The Greeks, who encountered him later, identified him with their own healing god Asklepios, and the synthesis produced a deity who had the characteristics of both, a mortal who had achieved divine status through extraordinary wisdom and healing skill. This is a pattern that appears in multiple ancient medical traditions, this movement from the revered healer to the healing deity, from the remembered person to the invoked power. It tells us something about how the ancient world understood the special quality of medical knowledge as something that touched the boundary between the human and the divine, that operated in the territory where the body met its own mortality and required something beyond mere technical skill to navigate. I want to stay in Egypt for a moment, because the Egyptian medical tradition is rich enough to deserve more than a brief sketch. The papyri that survive, the Edwin Smith, the Ebers Papyrus, the Cahoon Gynecological Papyrus, the Brooklyn Snake Papyrus, give us an unusually complete picture of ancient medicine, more complete than anything we have from Mesopotamia, because the dry desert climate of Egypt preserved organic material that the wet climate of the Mesopotamian river valley destroyed. The Ebers Papyrus, which dates to around 1550 BCE and is one of the oldest and longest surviving medical documents in the world, contains over 800 remedies and medical prescriptions. Reading it is a dizzying experience because it moves without apparent transition between procedures that look like rational empirical medicine and procedures that look like pure magic. A recipe for treating a stomach ailment: mix together certain plants, add a particular amount of beer, strain and drink for 4 days. This looks like medicine. Immediately following it, a remedy for the same ailment. Recite this incantation to the patient while the remedy is being prepared. This looks like magic. But to the Egyptian physician, there was no contradiction. Both the physical remedy and the verbal ritual were part of the same therapeutic act, addressing different dimensions of the same problem. The gynecological knowledge in the Cahoon Papyrus is particularly striking. This document, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains descriptions of women's conditions and their treatments that show a careful empirical attention to female physiology unusual in the ancient world. There are descriptions of conditions that sound like uterine prolapse and vaginal infections, with treatments that include physical manipulation and the application of preparations to the affected area. There is a pregnancy test. Place the woman's urine in a vessel and add a plant. If certain things happen, she is pregnant. The mechanism was wrong. The Egyptians did not understand what they were detecting. But some versions of this test have been experimentally validated as producing results better than chance. The observation was correct, even when the explanation was not. The heart occupied a special place in Egyptian medical understanding. The Egyptians regarded the heart as the seat of intelligence, emotion, and consciousness, the organ that made a person who they were, that contained what we would call the personality or the soul. This is not simply a spiritual belief held by priests and theologians. It is reflected throughout the medical papyri in the way the heart is discussed as the organizing center of the body's systems. There is a passage in the Epidaurus papyrus that describes what appears to be the cardiovascular system. The heart, it says, speaks in all the vessels of every limb. The Egyptian physicians had observed that the pulse, the beat of the heart, could be felt in multiple locations of the body, and they had concluded from this that the heart communicated with all the limbs through the vessels. They were right about the observation and wrong about the mechanism. They thought the vessels carried not blood but air and other substances, that the pulse was a kind of speech the heart conducted with the rest of the body. But the observation itself was acute. The mummification tradition gave Egyptian physicians something that no other ancient culture had in the same systematic way: regular exposure to the interior of the human body. The embalmers who prepared the bodies of the dead for mummification removed the organs routinely. The stomach, the intestines, the lungs, the liver were taken out and placed in canopic jars, while the heart was left in place. The brain was extracted through the nose using a hooked instrument and discarded, because the Egyptians thought the brain was nothing important. The regular handling of internal organs by a class of specialized practitioners who worked closely with the physicians and who were subject to the same priestly regulations that governed the medical profession gave Egyptian medicine an anatomical vocabulary and an empirical base that no other ancient tradition matched until the systematic dissections of the Hellenistic period in Alexandria. Now I need to take you to Greece, to a specific island and a specific tradition and a specific person who has become so much of a symbol that the person has almost disappeared behind the symbol. Hippocrates of Kos was born around 460 BCE on the Greek island of Kos, and he is the figure to whom the Western medical tradition traces its foundational commitment to empirical observation, rational analysis, and professional ethics. The Hippocratic corpus, the collection of approximately 60 medical texts that bear his name, was almost certainly not written by a single person. The texts are too various in style and approach and period to have a single author, and ancient scholars already acknowledged this. What the Hippocratic corpus represents is the output of a school of medical thought centered on Kos, operating over perhaps a century or more, committed to a specific approach to medicine that differed from what came before. The difference was not that Hippocratic medicine was secular, while earlier medicine was religious. The picture is more complicated than that. It was rather that the Hippocratic tradition insisted on a specific discipline of observation and reasoning, a specific refusal of supernatural explanation for what could be observed and what observation could explain. The text called on the sacred disease, the ancient term for epilepsy, which was called sacred because its sudden onset and dramatic convulsions were understood as divine possession, opens with what amounts to a manifesto. This disease is no more sacred than any other, and its cause is to be found in the same places as the cause of other diseases. The author then proceeds to describe the brain as the seat of the intellect and the origin of the disease's symptoms, in a passage that is considerably more accurate than anything in the Egyptian tradition's understanding of the brain. The brain is where the disease begins because the brain is where consciousness and perception are located. And when the brain is disordered, consciousness and perception are disordered. This is a substantial intellectual achievement, and it required both courage and a specific kind of intellectual commitment to the discipline of natural explanation. The refusal to say the gods did this when observation suggested something else. The Hippocratic physicians were not atheists and they were not anti-religious. They offered prayers and acknowledged divine assistance and worked within a tradition that included religious healing in its full range of practices. But in the clinic, at the bedside, they committed themselves to observation and reasoning rather than to supernatural explanation. And this methodological commitment produced a quality of medical observation that the ancient world had not achieved before. The Hippocratic case histories, the epidemics, are extraordinary documents. They record individual patients by name, location, and case history, the patient's age, their constitution, their symptoms, the progression of the illness day by day, and the outcome. The outcomes include death, and the deaths are recorded without apology or euphemism. The Hippocratic physician who wrote these records was committed to the accurate recording of what happened, including failures, because accurate records of failures are the only way to learn what does not work. Let me read you one. Not the actual words, the Greek is too far away, and the translation is always an approximation, but the shape of the thing. A man of about 40, strong constitution, pain in the right side, fever, cough, day 2. Worse, sweating, more fever, day 3. The patient seems to improve, but the fever does not fully break. Day 4, the fever returns with greater force. The cough becomes productive. Day 7. Crisis, the ancient medical concept of the critical day, the moment when the body either defeats the illness or is defeated by it. This patient's crisis on day 7 resolves favorably. He recovers. But the next case, a woman in the same city, similar age, similar initial presentation, similar progression. Her crisis comes later. It does not resolve. She dies. And the Hippocratic physician records both outcomes because both are data, and data is what the tradition requires. This is the birth of the clinical case history as a medical genre, and it is not a small thing. The clinical case history, the systematic recording of individual patients and their outcomes, is one of the foundations of evidence-based medicine, the practice of adjusting treatment based on what actually happens to patients rather than on what theory predicts should happen. The Hippocratic physicians did not have statistical methods or controlled trials or the epistemological framework within which modern medicine operates, but they had the fundamental commitment to recording what happened and learning from it, and that commitment is continuous from the epidemics to the case reports published in medical journals today. The great synthesis of ancient medicine came not in Greece proper, but in Alexandria, in that city we have already visited. In the period after Alexander's conquests, when Greek intellectual culture spread across the Near East and the accumulated medical knowledge of Egypt and Mesopotamia and India and Persia became available to Greek-trained physicians with the observational and analytical tools of the Hippocratic tradition. The two giants of this synthesis were Herophilus and Erasistratus, both of whom worked in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, both of whom I mentioned in the context of the library. But they deserve more than a mention. Herophilus was the first person in the Western tradition to systematically dissect human bodies and record what he found. The opportunity was provided by the Ptolemaic royal court, which permitted the dissection of condemned criminals, and possibly, in a more troubling claim made by later ancient sources, the vivisection of living criminals, though this is debated and may be later hostile propaganda. What is not debated is that Herophilus dissected human cadavers in a systematic way and produced anatomical descriptions of extraordinary accuracy. He correctly described the brain, distinguishing between the cerebrum and the cerebellum, and identifying the brain as the seat of intelligence and the origin of the nervous system. He described the liver and the duodenum. He measured the duodenum at 12 finger breadths in length and named it from that measurement, and it is still called the duodenum. He described the ovaries and was the first to recognize them as the female equivalent of the testes. He measured the pulse and used its character to diagnose disease, developing a systematic pulse doctrine that would influence medicine for the next 2,000 years. Erasistratus, working slightly after Herophilus, went further into the mechanisms of physiology. He described the heart as a pump and the valves of the heart as mechanisms that prevented the blood from flowing backward. He got the valves right, even though he misunderstood the relationship between the arteries and the veins, thinking that the arteries carried air and the veins carried blood. He came very close to understanding the circulation of the blood and might have reached it if the Alexandrian tradition had continued longer. He described the coiling of the intestines, the branching of the bronchi in the lungs, the division of nerves into sensory and motor functions. All of this was correct. All of it was based on direct observation of the human body in a way that had not been possible before and would not be possible again until Vesalius in the 16th century. The knowledge existed, it was written down, it was in the library, and then the library declined, and the political and institutional conditions that had made systematic human dissection possible in Ptolemaic Alexandria, the royal patronage, the intellectual freedom, the specific political decision to allow dissection of human cadavers, disappeared, and the knowledge that Herophilus and Erasistratus had accumulated survived only in the summaries and quotations that later writers made from their now lost texts. The man who mediated this knowledge to the Western tradition, imperfectly, partially, but decisively, was Galen of Pergamon. Born in 1209 CE in the city of Pergamon, in what is now Western Turkey, educated in Alexandria and in Athens and in Smyrna, and practicing eventually in Rome, Galen was the most systematic and most prolific medical writer of the ancient world. His surviving works fill 20 volumes in the standard modern edition. He wrote about anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, dietetics, pulse diagnosis, therapy of every kind. He performed dissections, not of human bodies, which were not permitted in Rome, but of animals, primarily the Barbary macaque, an ape whose anatomy he extrapolated, often incorrectly, to the human form. He synthesized the entire accumulated tradition of Greek medicine, engaging with Hippocrates and Herophilus and Erasistratus and dozens of other writers, arguing with them, building on them, correcting them, incorporating them into a system of medical understanding so comprehensive that the medieval world would not even attempt to go beyond it for over 1,000 years. Galen's influence was, in the long run, as much a problem as a gift. His synthesis was so authoritative, his system so comprehensive, his prose so confident, that medieval physicians, both in the Islamic world and in Christian Europe, treated his work as essentially final. To contradict Galen was not merely to take a different clinical view, it was to challenge an authority that had been invested with something approaching scriptural status. When Vesalius in 1543 published his anatomical atlas demonstrating that Galen's descriptions of human anatomy were wrong in hundreds of specific details, because Galen had been describing ape anatomy, not human anatomy. The resistance he encountered was partly institutional and professional, but partly a genuine cognitive difficulty. If Galen was wrong about anatomy, what else was he wrong about? And if the foundation of the medical tradition was uncertain, what was medicine left with? The Islamic world received Galen, along with the rest of the Greek medical tradition, through the Great Translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries, when the Abbasid Caliphate supported the systematic translation of Greek scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic. The Islamic physicians did not merely preserve and transmit what they received, they extended it, tested it against their own clinical experience, developed new pharmacological knowledge, and produced original works that would themselves become foundational for the subsequent tradition. Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the Latin tradition, wrote the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century, a systematic encyclopedia of medicine that synthesized Greek and Islamic medical knowledge into a format so comprehensive and so clearly organized that it remained a standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and in European universities until the 17th century. The surgery of the Islamic world extended beyond what the Greek tradition had achieved. Abu al-Qasim al-Zahrawi, known in the Latin world as Abul Qasis, wrote a surgical encyclopedia in the late 10th century that described over 200 surgical instruments, many of which he designed himself, and surgical procedures including the removal of cataracts, the treatment of skull fractures, the extraction of bladder stones, and the management of difficult deliveries. Some of his instruments are recognizable as the precursors of instruments still used today. His descriptions of surgical procedure are detailed enough to be operationally useful, which means they were based on actual surgical practice, on the accumulated experience of performing these procedures many times and learning from both successes and failures. The question of pain in all of this is one that haunts me more than any other. What did it mean to undergo surgery in the ancient world? The anesthesia question. How did ancient physicians manage the pain of surgical procedures that in many cases required the patient to remain still for extended periods under what we would now consider intolerable pain, is one that the ancient texts address obliquely and often incompletely. There were substances available that reduced pain and produced sedation: opium, mandrake root, henbane, alcohol. These were used in various combinations and preparations as preoperative sedatives. The Hippocratic texts mention the use of mandragora, mandrake, in surgical contexts. Medieval texts describe soporific sponges soaked in combinations of plant-derived sedatives, held under the patient's nose to induce unconsciousness before surgery. How effective these preparations were, how consistently they were applied, whether they produced genuine unconsciousness or merely reduced the patient's ability to resist. These are questions the texts do not fully answer. What the surgical literature does tell us is that speed was considered a primary surgical virtue. The surgeon who could remove a bladder stone or amputate a limb in the minimum possible time was the surgeon who caused the minimum possible suffering. and the training of surgical skill in the ancient world emphasized speed alongside accuracy for exactly this reason. A patient who died from surgical shock induced by prolonged pain was a patient who had been failed by a slow surgeon as much as by an inaccurate one. The relationship between the healer and the patient in the ancient world was not the clinical relationship of modern medicine, not the formal encounter between a professional and a client that is structured by law and protocol and the institutional context of the hospital. It was more intimate, more personal, and more unequal. The physician in the Hippocratic tradition was taught to observe the patient carefully, not just the symptoms but the patient's constitution, their habits, their history, their family, the season of the year, and the character of the climate. The patient was a person embedded in an environment, not a body presenting with a pathology, and the treatment of the patient required attention to the person as much as to the disease. There is a passage in the Hippocratic text on the physician that describes the ideal physician in terms that are simultaneously clinical and characterological. The physician should be clean, he should be well dressed, he should be pleasant in manner, he should inspire confidence, he should not speak more than necessary, he should be grave in his demeanour. When he enters a room where there is a sick person, he should think carefully before he speaks. The text is describing a performance, the performance of the physician's role, that serves a therapeutic function as well as an informational one. The patient who trusts the physician is a patient who is better able to participate in the treatment, who is less overwhelmed by fear, who can provide a more accurate history of their symptoms, who will be more compliant with the regimen the physician prescribes. The ancient physicians understood this. The bedside manner that we now treat as a supplement to clinical skill was, in the ancient world, understood as part of clinical skill itself. Let me give you one more figure, Agnodis. She is a legendary figure, possibly historical, possibly invented. The scholarship debates, described in a text from the 3rd century BCE as the first female physician in Athens. The story goes that Athenian law prohibited women from practicing medicine, or even being present at obstetrical deliveries, with the result that women were dying in childbirth rather than allow male physicians to attend them. Agnodis, according to the legend, disguised herself as a man, studied medicine under Herophilus in Alexandria, returned to Athens, and began practicing medicine, in particular gynecological and obstetrical medicine, while maintaining her disguise. When she was eventually discovered to be a woman, she was put on trial. The women of Athens came to her defense in such numbers that the law was changed and women were thereafter permitted to practice medicine freely. Whether or not Agnodis was real, and the story has the quality of legend, polished smooth by retelling, the legend encodes something real about the relationship between gender and medicine in the ancient world. Women were the primary practitioners of obstetrics and gynecology throughout antiquity, not because they were allowed to be, but because they had no choice. Female patients would not be attended by male physicians, and male physicians often could not legally or culturally attend female patients. The knowledge of women's bodies, of pregnancy and childbirth, and the diseases of the reproductive system was held primarily by women, by midwives who learnt from other midwives, whose expertise was transmitted in the same oral tradition as the knowledge of the Doggerland hunters, from woman to woman, accumulating across generations, embedded in practice rather than in texts. When the male medical tradition encountered this knowledge, in the Cahun Papyrus, in the Hippocratic gynecological texts, in the work of the Alexandrian physicians, it sometimes incorporated it, and sometimes ignored it, and sometimes got it badly wrong, by applying frameworks developed for male anatomy to female physiology in ways that did not fit. The gynecological errors in Galen are partly attributable to his working primarily from animal anatomy, but partly attributable to the systematic exclusion of women from the written medical tradition, with the consequence that the embodied knowledge that midwives held was inaccessible to the physicians who wrote the texts. There is something here that connects to every other story in this series. The knowledge that is not written down is always at risk. The knowledge of the Doggerland communities, which was not written down, went under with the sea that swallowed their landscape. The medical knowledge of the midwives, which was not written down, was at constant risk of disappearing whenever the chain of transmission broke, when the older midwife died before she could teach the younger one, when a community was disrupted by war or plague or displacement. The written tradition of ancient medicine, the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the papyri of Egypt, the texts of the Hippocratic corpus, The encyclopedias of Galen and Ibn Sina survived because it was written, because it was copied, because the scholarly tradition of medicine regarded the preservation and transmission of medical knowledge as a serious professional obligation. And what was transmitted in the end? What do we actually owe to the medicine of the ancient world? More than is usually acknowledged. The pharmacological knowledge preserved in the ancient texts includes the identification of plant-derived substances that are still in use in modern medicine, sometimes in their original form and sometimes in synthetic versions of their active compounds. The clinical tradition of the case history, of systematic observation and recording, is continuous from the Hippocratic epidemics to the case reports of the present. The ethical tradition of medicine, the commitment to the patient's welfare, the obligation to be honest about prognosis, the prohibition against using the physician's position to exploit the patient's vulnerability, traces itself with justification to the Hippocratic tradition. But I want to resist a narrative of simple continuity, of ancient wisdom smoothly transmitted and built upon, because the transmission was not smooth and the losses were real. The anatomical knowledge of Herophilus and Erasistratus, which would have given the medieval world a 2,000-year head start on understanding the human body's structure, was not transmitted. The surgical encyclopedia of Abulcasis was translated into Latin and used in European medical schools, but the Arabic surgical tradition from which it emerged continued to develop in directions that European medicine did not follow until centuries later. The gynecological knowledge held by midwives across the ancient world is largely lost, precisely because it was not written down by the people who held it. The clay tablet in the British Museum, with its instructions for treating headaches, grind these plants, add fat, apply while speaking these words to the goddess, was written by someone who understood that human beings in pain need more than a physical remedy. They need to be addressed, to be seen, to be part of a relationship in which someone with knowledge and authority is attending to their suffering and doing what can be done. The words to the goddess were not nothing. They were the healer saying, "I am not alone in this treatment. There are powers greater than me involved. I am calling on them on your behalf." The patient heard this and was, if not cured, at least less alone. This is not a lesson that medicine has fully absorbed, even now. The history of ancient medicine is not merely the prehistory of modern medicine. It is the record of human beings encountering the oldest and most universal problem of their existence, the fact that the body breaks and breaks them, and finding ways to face that problem that were as complicated and as human as they needed to be. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me go back to the beginning. Let me go back to the moment before any of this was written down, before any clay tablet or papyrus preserved the knowledge of a healer's practice. Because medicine is older than writing. It is as old as pain, which is as old as the body that feels it, which means it is older than our species in any strict sense. The fossil record shows evidence of bone injuries that were healed, of individuals who survived injuries severe enough that they could only have been cared for by others, in species that preceded Homo sapiens by hundreds of thousands of years. Care of the sick and injured is not a human invention, it is a mammalian inheritance. But the specific form that medical knowledge takes in human communities, the organized practice of healing, the transmission of knowledge from one healer to the next, the development of a pharmacopoeia and a set of clinical procedures, this begins somewhere in the deep Paleolithic, in the practices of people who left no written record and whose healing knowledge survives, if it survives at all, only in the most indirect traces. The plant knowledge of indigenous healing traditions in the present day sometimes contains compounds of genuine pharmacological activity that the tradition has been using for centuries or millennia, which suggests that the process of identifying useful plants through observation and experiment is very old indeed, older than any written record. The healers of the ancient world inherited from still more ancient healers, and those from healers before them, in a chain of transmission that runs back further than we can see. What I want to try to give you, what I want to try to feel with you before we return to the specific figures and the specific texts, is the quality of what it meant to be sick in the ancient world. Not in the abstract, but in the specific, sensory, experiential sense. Because the history of medicine is ultimately the history of the relationship between human consciousness and human suffering. And that relationship is always particular, always embodied, always situated in a specific moment of pain or fear or confusion. You are sick. You are in Babylon in the early 2nd millennium BCE. You have a fever that has been rising for 3 days. Your joints ache. Your head feels full of something pressing outward. You cannot eat. The people around you are frightened, not just because they love you, but because illness in the ancient world was always potentially catastrophic. There was no treatment for the secondary infections that turned moderate illness into fatal illness, no understanding of the mechanisms by which disease spread, no infrastructure of quarantine that could reliably contain epidemic disease. When people got sick in the ancient world, other people got sick too, and the community watched the progression of illness with an attention sharpened by genuine fear. The healer who comes to attend you is a man of considerable status. The Asu, the physician, or the Ashipu, the exorcist, or both working together, because the Babylonian medical tradition often deployed both simultaneously. He has been trained in the scribal schools, where the medical texts were copied and memorized, alongside the legal and administrative and literary texts that formed the core of Babylonian education. He carries with him a collection of plant materials, dried, ground, some in clay containers, some in leather pouches, and a set of ritual equipment, an amulet, a specific spoken formula that he has memorized from the tablets, perhaps a clay figurine representing the demon of illness that is to be expelled. The demon theory of disease is worth pausing over because it has been dismissed too easily as mere superstition. In the Babylonian system, illness was caused by the entry of a demon, a specific demon, because there were specific demons associated with specific illnesses, into the patient's body. The demon had been sent or had arrived because of some breach in the patient's relationship with the divine order, some ritual omission, some sin, some moment of inattention that had left the patient vulnerable. The healer's task was to identify the demon and expel it, to restore the patient's relationship with the protective divine forces, and to support the body with physical remedies while the ritual work was done. This system is not simply wrong in the way that a failed experiment is wrong. It is wrong about the mechanism. Illness is not caused by demons, but it is right about several important things. It is right that illness often has both physical and psychological dimensions, and that treating only the physical dimension while ignoring the psychological is incomplete. It is right that the sick person's sense of their place in the moral and social order, their feeling of whether they are living correctly, of whether they are in right relationship with the forces that govern their world, affects their recovery. It is right that ritual, ceremony, and the invocation of authorities greater than the healer provide a kind of support that physical treatment alone cannot provide. The placebo effect, in its modern formulation, is a real medical phenomenon, and the incantations of the Babylonian healer were one mechanism for activating something that looks very much like it. The patient lies on a mat in the courtyard of the house. The healer is beside him. The healer examines the patient. He looks at the color of the skin and the whites of the eyes. He presses the abdomen to check for distension or pain. He listens to the breathing. He looks at the tongue. Then he speaks the incantation. The words are addressed to Namtar, the demon of fate and illness, and to Ishtar, the great goddess, and to the patient's personal protective deity, and to the sun god Shamash, who sees everything and can be called as witness to the healer's work. The words are not improvised. They are memorized, specific, drawn from the tradition that has been accumulating for generations. Their power, in the belief system of the patient and the healer both, lies precisely in their specificity, in the fact that these are the right words, the words that have worked before, the words that the tradition has identified as effective for this particular condition. After the incantation, the physical treatment. The healer mixes a preparation, licorice root ground to a fine powder, perhaps some cedar oil, some plant material whose identification we are uncertain of. He applies it, or directs its application, to the patient. He instructs the family on diet. The sick person should eat only certain foods, in specific quantities, at specific times. He instructs on behavior. The patient should not do these things, should rest, should be kept warm or kept cool. He will return tomorrow to assess the progression of the illness and revise the treatment if necessary. This is recognizable. This is medicine. The incantation makes it strange to us, but the clinical structure is familiar. Examination, diagnosis, treatment, instruction, follow-up. The Babylonian healer was not practicing superstition in ignorance of any better alternative. He was practicing the best medicine available in his context, in a framework that incorporated both the physical and the divine dimensions of illness, because his world did not separate those dimensions. The clay tablets that recorded his knowledge were the medical literature of his tradition, as seriously maintained and as carefully transmitted as any medical literature since. Now let me take you to a different kind of healer's space entirely. To the Asklepion, the healing sanctuary dedicated to the god of medicine that existed in dozens of locations across the Greek world from the 5th century BCE onward, of which the most famous and most extensively excavated is the sanctuary at Epidaurus in the northeastern Peloponnese. The Asklepion at Epidaurus sits in a valley in the hills of the Argolid, a few kilometers from the coast, in a landscape that even now has a quality of sheltered remoteness, of being slightly apart from the ordinary world. In its ancient heyday, it was a complex of buildings, the great temple of Asklepion himself, circular and marble, its floor holding the famous chryselephantine statue, gold and ivory, of the god, the abaton, or enkomition, the dormitory where the sick slept and received healing dreams, the sacred spring, the healing baths, and the tholos, a circular building whose underground chambers served some function still debated by archaeologists, perhaps housing the sacred snakes that were central to the cult. The sick came to Epidaurus from across the Greek world. They came in the ordinary expectation of ancient pilgrimage. They had travelled, perhaps for weeks, to reach a place of known power. They had prepared themselves through ritual purification, through abstinence from certain foods and activities, through prayer. They arrived exhausted and hopeful in the specific mixture that all long-sought healing inspires. And at the Asklepion they entered into a process. Incubation is the technical term in which they slept in the abaton and waited for the god or his agents to come to them in a dream and reveal the cause of their illness and its cure. The inscriptions that survive from Epidaurus record the dreams and the cures. A man with a stomach ailment dreams that the god opens his belly and removes a frog. He wakes healed. A woman who has been unable to conceive dreams that she sleeps with the god. She becomes pregnant within the year. A blind man dreams that the god's servants apply ointment to his eyes. His sight improves. These are not the records of frauds or cynics. The inscriptions were maintained by the priests of the sanctuary with evident seriousness, as documentation of divine intervention for the benefit of future pilgrims. The people who reported these dreams believed what they reported. The healing they experienced, some of it surely, was real healing, whatever its mechanism. The mechanism of healing at the Asklepion was not exclusively the miracle of divine intervention. The sanctuary provided rest, a healthy diet, exercise. The great theatre at Epidaurus, still one of the most perfectly preserved in the ancient world, hosted theatrical performances that were part of the healing program. Bathing in the spring waters and the company of other sick people who were also seeking healing and who formed, for the duration of their time at the sanctuary, a community of shared purpose. These are conditions that we now understand are genuinely beneficial for recovery from many conditions. Rest, good nutrition, exercise, social support, the experience of beauty in music and drama. The modern evidence for the therapeutic value of these things is substantial. The Asklepion was delivering, alongside the religious experience of incubation and divine dream, a program of care that had real physical benefits for many of its patients. The sacred snakes of the Asklepion were also not merely symbolic. The species kept in the sanctuary, Elaphe longissima, the Asklepion snake, a non-venomous European species that is still named for the god, licked the wounds and eyes of the sleeping patients in the abaton. Snake saliva contains antimicrobial compounds, and the action of the snake's tongue on a wound would have had some cleansing effect. The snake was not an entirely inert symbolic presence. It was doing something, and what it was doing was not entirely without medical benefit. All of this seems, from our perspective, to mix the rational and the irrational in a way that is characteristic of the ancient medical world more broadly. The rational treatment, rest, diet, exercise, wound care, and the irrational treatment, the incubation dream, the divine snake, the sacrifice to the god, were not understood as separate systems by the people who practiced them. They were one system, operating on the assumption that the sick person was a being whose body, mind, and divine relationships were all involved in illness, and all needed to be addressed in healing. This is not an assumption that modern medicine has entirely rejected, even if it has largely replaced the divine dimension with the psychological. The field of psychoneuroimmunology, the study of the interactions between psychological states, the nervous system, and the immune system, is a serious area of scientific research that has demonstrated real relationships between mental states and physical health outcomes. The depressed patient heals more slowly. The anxious patient experiences more pain. The patient who trusts their physician has better outcomes than the one who does not. The ancient healers did not know the mechanisms through which these effects operated, but they observed the phenomena, and their medical systems were in many cases organized around addressing them directly. Let me tell you about two specific patients, both of them real, both of them named in the ancient sources, whose experiences of ancient medicine give us something of the texture of what it meant to seek healing in the ancient world. The first is Aelius Aristides, a Greek orator and hypochondriac of the 2nd century CE, who spent much of his adult life at the Asklepion at Pergamon, under the care of the god Asclepios, and who left behind an extensive account of his experiences there in a work called The Sacred Tales. Aristides was genuinely ill. He had a multiplicity of conditions, some clearly physical, and some that modern readers tend to diagnose as psychosomatic, though the distinction is less clear than it seems, and he submitted himself to the god's directions with a completeness that is both moving and somewhat alarming. The god told him to swim in the cold river in winter. He swam. The god told him to run barefoot through the snow. He ran. The god told him to abstain from food for days at a stretch, then to eat specific foods at specific times, then to take particular baths, then to give particular speeches. Aristides did all of this and believed, with complete sincerity, that it was the god's direct intervention in his life. His relationship with the god was, he writes, the most important relationship of his life, more important than his relationships with his teachers or his friends or the city of Rome where he had made his career. The god appeared to him in dreams and spoke to him directly and guided him through every aspect of his life, not just his medical care. Aristides was not unusual in this. The relationship between a devotee of Aeschylus and the god was understood, in the Greek world of his time, as a genuine personal relationship, as real and as particular as any other relationship in the devotee's life. The god knew Aristides, had chosen to attend to his specific case, was available to be consulted about the specifics of his treatment. This was not metaphor. It was the framework within which healing was understood to occur. The second patient is Apollodorus of Cyzicus, known only from a single inscription at Epidaurus that records his case. He was blind in one eye, and he came to the sanctuary and slept in the abaton. And he received a dream in which the god came to him, separated the eyelid, and poured something into the eye. When he woke, he could see. The inscription records this as a fact, with the specific information that the healer god saw the god's treatment. Whatever actually happened, whether the incubation experience somehow resolved a condition that had a functional rather than structural component, whether the combination of rest and suggestion and the ritual experience produced a change in the nervous system's processing of visual information. Apollodorus left the sanctuary, able to see out of his previously blind eye, and the sanctuary recorded his cure as evidence of the god's power and a testament for future pilgrims. I find both of these patients moving, not because I believe what they believed, I do not, and honesty requires me to say so, but because I recognize in their experience something that is not foreign to me, the desire to be attended to by something larger than oneself, to have one's suffering witnessed and addressed by a power that can do more than I can do for myself, the willingness to submit to a demanding regimen because the authority prescribing it commands trust, the experience of improvement after a period of care that was both physical and spiritual, and the impossibility of distinguishing clearly between the contribution of each. The history of medicine is the history of this complicated transaction between the sick person and the healer, in which the content of the medical knowledge being applied is only one of the variables. The other variables, the quality of the relationship, the trust inspired, the ritual and ceremony around the treatment, the community context in which healing occurs, are not supplementary to the medicine. They are part of what medicine is and what it does. The ancient healers knew this. The clay tablet healer with his incantation to the goddess knew it. The priest at the Asklepion knew it. The Hippocratic physician who was told to dress well and speak gravely and inspire confidence knew it. The Islamic physician who was taught that the first duty of the healer was to the patient's dignity knew it. What we have sometimes lost in the progressive professionalization and technologization of modern medicine is not the knowledge that these things matter. The research demonstrates that they do, but the systematic attention to them as part of the core practice of medicine, rather than as supplementary to it. The ancient healers did not have the specific clinical knowledge that modern medicine has accumulated, but they operated in a framework that understood the whole person, body, mind, and relationship to the larger forces that govern existence as the object of medical care. And that commitment to the whole person is something that the history of medicine suggests we abandon at our peril. The clay tablet in the British Museum, the words to the goddess, the fats and the ground plants, the healer's grave manner and his clean dress, and the confidence he inspired when he entered the room, the specific words, memorized from the tradition, spoken with authority to the sick person lying on their mat in the courtyard. These were not nothing, they were medicine. They were the best medicine available, applied with as much skill and care as the healer could bring to it, in a tradition that stretched behind him and would stretch ahead, carrying the accumulated knowledge of how human beings had learnt to care for each other in the face of the body's failures. 4,000 years later, we are still in that tradition, still learning, still failing sometimes, still doing the best we can with what we have, still, in the moments that matter most, reaching beyond the purely technical to something that the ancient healers would have recognized, the presence of one human being with another who is suffering, attending to that suffering with whatever knowledge and whatever powers of connection and comfort are available, trying to help. I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Let me take you to the operating table, or rather, to whatever the ancient equivalent was, because the operating table is a very recent invention, the table on which the patient is laid out under controlled conditions in a sterile field with the surgeon's instruments arrayed in a specific order beside it. What the ancient surgeon had was rougher than this, and what happened on it was rougher too. But it was not therefore not surgery, and what the ancient surgeon knew was not therefore not knowledge. I want to describe a cataract operation in ancient India, because the Indian surgical tradition, the Sushruta Samhita, the surgical text attributed to the physician Sushruta and dated to approximately 600 BCE, though the text in its current form is later, describes a procedure called couching, which was the standard treatment for cataracts in the ancient world, which was performed in India, in the Arab world, and eventually in medieval Europe. It is a procedure of considerable elegance given the constraints within which it was performed, and understanding it tells you something important about the relationship between courage and knowledge, and the limits of what human hands can do. A cataract is an opacity of the lens of the eye, the natural lens that sits behind the iris, through which light passes to reach the retina. When the lens clouds, vision decreases, eventually to near blindness. The modern treatment is the surgical removal of the opaque lens and its replacement with an artificial one, performed under local anesthetic with microscopic instruments in a procedure that takes perhaps 20 minutes and is one of the most successful surgical interventions in medicine. The ancient treatment, couching, did something simpler and less complete. It displaced the opaque lens out of the line of sight, pushing it back into the vitreous body of the eye with a needle, where it would sink to the bottom and no longer obstruct vision. This did not restore full sight. It restored enough sight to function, and it required extraordinary steadiness of hand and confidence of nerve to perform. Sushruta's description of the procedure is detailed and specific in the way that a teaching text needs to be. The patient is seated in a well-lit room, facing the light. The surgeon sits before the patient and steadies the patient's head. The eye is held open. A sharp needle, the Jabamukhi Salika, a specific instrument described in detail in the text, is introduced into the white of the eye, to the side of the cornea, at a specific angle and to a specific depth. The needle then moves to engage the cataract and push it back. The success of the procedure is assessed immediately. Does the patient see the surgeon's finger when it is raised before the eye? If yes, the procedure has succeeded. The needle is withdrawn. The eye is treated with oil and butter and covered with a bandage. The margin for error in this procedure is extremely small. The needle can penetrate too far and damage the retina, causing permanent blindness. It can move in the wrong direction and tear the iris. It can introduce infection into the interior of the eye with catastrophic consequences. Performing it on another human being, on a patient who is trusting you with the last of their sight, requires a specific kind of confidence, built on the specific kind of experience that comes from having performed the procedure many times. The ancient surgical tradition understood this. The training in surgery described in the Sushruta Samhita involves extensive practice on vegetables and animal tissues and cadavers before any student was permitted to operate on a living patient. The teaching was systematic and graded and based on the recognition that surgical skill is a physical skill as well as a cognitive one, and that it requires the same kind of practice that any physical skill requires. The Sushruta Samhita describes over 100 surgical procedures. It describes rhinoplasty, the reconstruction of the nose using a flap of skin from the forehead, a procedure that became necessary in ancient India because nasal amputation was a punishment for certain crimes, and that was so well developed in the Indian tradition that it eventually made its way into European surgery in the 18th century, when British surgeons in India observed Indian surgeons performing it and brought the technique back to England. This is the path by which the forehead flap rhinoplasty entered the Western surgical tradition. From ancient India through observation by colonial-era British surgeons, 2,000 years after Sushruta described the technique, this kind of transmission, the rediscovery in one tradition of what another tradition had already developed and whose transmission had somehow failed, is one of the recurring patterns in the history of medicine. The knowledge existed, it was not transmitted, it had to be found again. How much knowledge has been lost and found again over the millennia of the medical tradition, we can only partially estimate, because the loss itself leaves limited traces. The lost female medical tradition. I want to return to this because I have mentioned it and moved past it too quickly. The midwives and the wise women, the healers who were women, working with women, operating in the domestic and reproductive sphere that male physicians often could not or did not enter, are the great gap in the ancient medical record. We know they existed, we know they held extensive knowledge, we know their knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship and practice, woman to woman, in the same way that all craft knowledge was transmitted in the ancient world, and we know that almost none of it made it into the written record. The exceptions are partial and revealing. Trotta of Salerno, a female physician associated with the medical school at Salerno in the 11th and 12th centuries, whose actual identity and contribution are contested by scholars, is the author credited with medical texts on gynecology and cosmetics that were widely copied and read throughout medieval Europe. Whether Trotta was a real individual or a name attached to texts that had multiple origins, the texts themselves contain practical gynecological knowledge that is consistent with the kind of embodied clinical experience that a practicing midwife or female physician would accumulate. The texts know things about pregnancy and childbirth that the male medical tradition had gotten wrong, and the difference comes precisely from the tradition's origin in women's practice. Aspasia, who is mentioned in a 6th century CE Byzantine medical encyclopedia as a female physician whose work on gynecology and obstetrics was worth citing, is another figure in this partial record. She is described as knowing procedures for turning a malpositioned fetus, for managing difficult deliveries, for the treatment of postpartum complications. These are things that midwives and female physicians in the ancient world would have developed through centuries of practice, through the accumulated experience of attending hundreds of deliveries and observing what worked and what did not. The encyclopedia cites her as an authority. Her work has otherwise not survived. The silence around female medical practitioners in the ancient world is not the silence of women who had nothing to contribute. It is the silence of a tradition that was not valued highly enough to be written down by the people who did the writing, which in the ancient world were predominantly men, educated in institutions that were predominantly male, working within a culture that ascribed intellectual authority predominantly to men. The knowledge that midwives held, accumulated across millennia of practice, is largely gone, not because it was wrong, not because it failed to work, but because it lived in the hands and memories and oral traditions of women who were not invited to participate in the written record. This is, in miniature, the problem of all medical knowledge that was not written down. The Babylonian demon exorcist's accumulation of practical knowledge about which plants reduced fever and which reduced pain. The Egyptian embalmer's intimate knowledge of the body's interior. The Greek midwife's knowledge of the signs that predict a dangerous delivery. the Sushrata Samhita's description of plastic surgical techniques that had been refined over centuries before it was set down in text. All of this knowledge was hard-won through the experience of healing and failing and healing again across many generations. Some of it was written down and survived. Most of it was not written down and did not. What did survive, through the Galenic synthesis and the Islamic translations and the medieval European universities, is a specific selection from the total of ancient medical knowledge. The selection that was valued and copied and transmitted by the people who did the writing, which was not a random selection, but a selection shaped by the class and gender and cultural priorities of the people who maintained the written tradition. We have received the ancient medical tradition as a series of documents, and the documents are not the tradition, they are what the tradition chose to write down, and the tradition was choosy in ways that reflect its specific social context as much as its medical judgment. I think about this every time I encounter a plant remedy in the ancient texts that modern pharmacology has confirmed to be effective. Licorice for inflammation, willow bark for pain, poppy for suffering. These were not discovered by the physicians who recorded them in the tablets and papyri. They were discovered by the practice of generations of healers, most of them unnamed, working in the long period before the written record began, observing what plants did what and accumulating that knowledge in the oral tradition that the written texts eventually recorded. The tablets are the iceberg's tip. Below them, in the water, is the enormous dark mass of the knowledge that was never written. There is one more thing I want to give you before we come to rest. It is not a figure or a text or a practice. It is a room. The room is in an ancient hospital, the bimaristan, the Islamic institution for the care of the sick that represents, in the history of medicine, one of the most significant institutional innovations of the medieval period. The great bimaristans of Baghdad and Cairo and Damascus in the 9th through 13th centuries were not merely places where the sick were brought to be treated. They were also teaching institutions, where students observed clinical practice, and research institutions, where physicians accumulated observations about disease and its treatment, and charitable institutions, where the poor were treated without charge. They had separate wards for different types of illness, infectious disease separated from psychiatric illness, male patients from female, the convalescent from the acutely sick. They had pharmacies with extensive formularies supplied by the herbal garden that most bimaristans maintained. They had surgical theatres where operations were performed and observed. The room I want to give you is a ward in the Bimaristan al-Mansuri in Cairo, built in 1284 and one of the most celebrated medieval hospitals in the world. The ward is for patients with mental illness, a category of patient that the Islamic medical tradition treated with remarkable sophistication, understanding mental illness as a condition of the brain and the spirits, rather than as demonic possession or moral failure, and treating it with the same combination of physical remedies and environmental therapy that was applied to other illnesses. The ward has music. This is not a small thing. The bimaristans were among the first medical institutions in the world to use music systematically as a therapeutic intervention. Musicians employed by the hospital performed for the patients on the understanding that the qualities of different musical modes affected the spirits and could contribute to recovery. The patients are in a space that has been designed with their specific needs in mind. Ventilation to prevent the build-up of noxious airs that might worsen their condition, running water from a fountain in the courtyard that served both hygienic and calming functions, gardens visible through the arched windows. The physicians who attend them observe their behavior carefully and record their observations in the hospital's casebooks. The specific knowledge of psychiatric medicine that the Islamic Bimaristan tradition developed, the understanding that environmental factors affect the course of mental illness, the use of occupational therapy in the form of music and handwork and garden maintenance, the recognition that different types of mental illness required different treatments, preceded the equivalent developments in Western psychiatry by several centuries. The first European institution specifically designed for the care of the mentally ill that adopted comparable therapeutic principles opened in the 19th century. The Bimaristan tradition had reached these conclusions in the 9th century. This is not an argument that the Islamic medical tradition was superior to the Western one in some global sense. Both traditions had achievements and failures, blind spots and insights. The Islamic surgical tradition was largely lost to European medicine after the collapse of the translation movement. The Greek clinical tradition, preserved through Galen, gave medieval European medicine a systematic framework for understanding disease that, however wrong in many of its specific claims, at least organized medical thinking in a coherent way. What the comparison demonstrates is something more specific, that the history of medicine is not a simple progressive story, a straight line from ignorance to knowledge, from superstition to science. It is a complicated web of insights and losses, of knowledge accumulated and then neglected, of practices developed in one tradition and only later discovered in another. We are still in the middle of this web. We are still, every year, discovering that specific plants used in traditional medicine systems across the world contain compounds of genuine pharmacological activity, compounds that the indigenous practitioners who used those plants identified through empirical observation over centuries, long before the mechanisms could be understood. We are still, every year, discovering that interventions once dismissed as superstition or placebo, meditation, acupuncture, certain herbal preparations have measurable effects on health outcomes that can be studied with modern methods. We are still learning that some of what the ancient healers knew was more than ignorance dressed in ritual. The clay tablet healer, the Egyptian embalmer who knew the interior of the body, the Hippocratic physician recording the case of a patient who died of a fever on the 7th day, Herophilus at his dissection table in Alexandria, Sushruta training his students to operate on vegetables before they touched a living eye, Ibn Sina writing the canon by lamplight in a house of a Central Asian patron who had provided him refuge, the midwife who had attended 100 difficult births and knew, in her hands and her experience, things about the female body that no written text had ever recorded, the musician in the bimaristan playing for a man whose mind had broken and who sat quietly in the ward and sometimes, when the music was right, seemed to come back to himself. These are the ancestors of medicine, not the founders. Medicine has no single founding moment, no creation story, only the long accumulation of human attention to human suffering that begins before memory and continues to the present. They are the people who did the work, who came when they were called, who brought what they knew and applied it as carefully as they could, who recorded what they learned when they recorded it, so that the next generation of healers would know a little more than they had known, who failed, sometimes, and recorded the failure, so that the next generation would also know what did not work. The body breaks. It has always broken. The people who devoted their lives to understanding how and why, and to doing what they could for the people it broke. They were practicing something that defies the categories we now apply to medicine. It was science and art and religion and philosophy and human connection all at once, because the situation demanded all of those things simultaneously. I think about the healer at the bedside in Babylon 4,000 years ago, grinding the plants and speaking the words and watching the patient's face. I think about the Hippocratic physician at the deathbed, writing in his case notes, "She died on the 7th day." I think about Herophilus in the dissection room in Alexandria, looking at the human brain and understanding, for the first time, that this was where consciousness lived. I think about the musician in the bimaristan, playing for a man who sat in the corner and would not speak. All of them were doing the same thing, bringing what they knew to someone who was suffering, trying, with that knowledge and with everything else they had, to help. The tablet says, grind these plants, add fat, speak these words to the goddess, apply the preparation, and then wait. Because the healer's art is partly action and partly witness, partly the confident application of accumulated knowledge, and partly the humble acknowledgement that some things are beyond what any knowledge can reach. 4,000 years later, we are still learning that difference. I wish you a calm and peaceful night.